2 years after the war, as late as 1947, Stalin still remained optimistic as ever that the Americans and the Russians will together divide the world between themselves and together prevent Germany from rearming and emerging as a power in Europe while they engage in lucrative economic relations. I was about 4 or 5 years old, around 1959, when I came across this image in a bound collection of wartime editions of the Soviet satirical political humor magazine Crocodile. And when I saw this, even as a child, I knew there was something wrong with this image. The friendship portrayed in this image was opposite to everything I was seeing on TV, in the movies, and in picture magazines like Life and Look. My father had arrived in Canada as a Russian refugee in the early 1950s, and as libraries in Toronto began discarding their Soviet wartime periodicals during the Cold War era, he acquired a collection of bound Soviet magazines from the wartime period and the post-war period, which now are in my possession and are the source of many of the never before seen images from that era that I share with you in these lectures. These wartime publications are extremely rare, as even in Russia, after the death of Stalin, in the process of de-Stalinization under Khrushchev after 1956, many of these publications and any record of them were destroyed as the history of the Stalin era became politically incorrect. But looking at these periodicals today, one gets a very different sense of certainly the Soviet perspective on that early Cold War period. And somehow these images of the three chauffeurs, obviously the images set at either Yalta or Potsdam. The magazine in particular is from July of 1945, so on the eve of Potsdam, and these are the three chauffeurs of the big three who are meeting somewhere inside that villa, taking a smoke break. And it's a very almost naive image of that period from a country that certainly is not credited with being particularly naive at that moment, especially under Stalin's leadership. The Soviet Union had undergone profound change after the war. This painting by the Soviet painter Yuri Pimenov, New Moscow, was painted in 1937. It portrays a woman at the wheel of a convertible automobile driving up a sunny, crowded Moscow street with restored classic architecture flanked by new socialist block apartment buildings and busy, crowded sidewalks. It smacks of a kind of a socialist affluence and optimism, and yet at the same time, as a historian, one knows that it cloaks a very dark reality and price to be paid for that affluence. 1937 was, of course, the year of the Great Terror, when Stalin had 1.5 million Soviet citizens arrested as traitors, and half of them, 750,000, summarily executed, while the other half were put to work as slave labor working on the industrialization and modernization of Russia. 7 years later, Pimenov would update his painting, Front Road, 1944. War had completely destroyed whatever economic progress the Soviets could claim, but not the mechanisms of state repression under Stalin. Those were simply thrown behind the war effort and would be deployed behind Reconstruction after the war. The Gulag and the midnight knock at the door from the secret police continued on as before, at best perhaps on a smaller scale than in the 1930s. In the United States, the return of American GIs home was portrayed sweetly in these Norman Rockwell scenes. Approximately 1.2 million American soldiers fought in the war, both in Europe and the Pacific, and 405,000 were killed over, I guess, a period of from 1941 to 1945, over a period of 4 years, 100,000 less than the coronavirus killed in just a period of 1 year. The remainder returned to their families. Some returned without limbs, physically disabled. Some 37% of US soldiers discharged during the war were discharged as neuropsychiatric casualties, the term used back then for what we today describe as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. A very recent RAND Corporation study of World War II US casualties reported that in 1946, some 455,000 war veterans were on psychiatric disability, 30% of all service-connected disability awards. That mental toll on GIs and combat in Europe and the Pacific to this day has been much underreported, understudied, and underestimated. In Russia, there were similar sweet Norman Rockwell-like homecomings, but on a different scale. Some 34 million Russians served in the war, 28 times the US rate of service. Compared to the 405,000 US soldiers killed, the Russians lost 12 million. About 2,500 US civilians caught in the war, mostly in the Pacific, died either in bombings, for example, 68 Americans at Pearl Harbor, or Japanese internment camps. Approximately 19 million Soviet civilians died in the same period. In Russia, it was a matter of female and child survivors reuniting with the few male survivors returning from the war. If there were any neuropsychiatric war casualties in the Soviet Union, they would have been difficult to discern from the rest of the war-traumatized civilian survivors, let alone those who had gone through the Civil War, the collectivization, and the Great Terror in the previous decades. For many Russians, the Second World War was just more of the same that they had endured for the previous 20 years. Not just Russian men, but many women as well had served in combat. As the caption for this cartoon reads, "Comes a soldier from the front." Soviet domestic propaganda images reflected the difficult return to normalcy from war footing. Hostile speeches by Churchill and Truman were relatively underreported in the USSR, but those in the know were well aware of the increasing chilling relations between the USSR and its former allies. Many remained prepared for war on a kind of gut level, as much as they attempted to, again, return to normalcy. Again, the caption in this particular cartoon, the top caption reads, "Wartime experience." The bottom caption reads, "Clever camouflage." Cute. The fact that the United States now was the single superpower in the world, the only nation armed with atomic weapons, was a disconcerting position for the Soviet Union to find itself in after what it had experienced at the hands of Nazi Germany and its Italian, Hungarian, Romanian, Bulgarian, and Finnish allies. But in February 1947, despite the chill that is beginning to enter in East-West relations, peace treaties with all the minor Axis powers were finally signed. Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland. Now, the Allies were close to concluding a final peace treaty with Germany and Austria. The alliance was a little tattered, but still basically intact some 2 years after the war had ended, into 1947. The Western Soviet Union had been completely destroyed by the Nazis in the course of the war. And now it was mostly a female workforce, with so many men dead in combat. It was mostly a female workforce that would now be rebuilding the Soviet Union, augmented by the labor of German prisoners of war. In 1950, 5 years after the war, there were just 76.6 men per 100 women in the USSR. That number would slowly creep in subsequent decades, climbing by 2014 to 86 men per 100 women, but nowhere near the US and Canadian figure the same year, 2014, 97 men to 100 women. The Soviet military achievement, the defeat of Germany, was celebrated and closely tied to the Russian desire to secure their borders from Western intervention and invasion, something that modern Russia has been experiencing on the Black Sea since the Crimean War in the 1850s, and on its European flank since The First World War, the Allied intervention after the revolution during the Russian Civil War. On this tank, you could see all the names of the cities that were on the Russian campaign towards Berlin: Stalingrad, Sofia, Warsaw, Bucharest, Budapest, Bratislava, Belgrade, Dresden, Prague, Vienna, Berlin. The initiation of the Reconstruction process in the Soviet Union was kickstarted by huge seizures the Soviets were making through reparations in Germany and other Nazi-allied countries under Russian occupation in the East. But these expropriations, including the use of prisoner of war slave labor, were finite. They could kickstart Reconstruction, but not sustain it. Only expanding trade with the United States, consumer goods in exchange for natural resources, just as planned by Roosevelt and Stalin, could sustain that reconstruction of a devastated Soviet Union. Stalin remained optimistic about the prospect of this future trade, even under Harry S. Truman, because as Stalin had calculated, with the war over, American factories that had produced munitions would be closing. U.S. unemployment would rise, and neither Americans nor the war-devastated Europeans could afford American consumer goods, the production of which potentially could offset the closure of war industries. Only Russia had the natural resources available to trade for American consumer goods. In Stalin's calculations, this mutual economic need would ensure friendly relations between the two countries and good business relations. The Americans, however, had something else in mind by 1947. A policy of containment of communism had been adopted by the Truman administration. But how to carry it out? At first, US and Britain began focusing on undermining Western communist movements in France, Italy, and Greece. As American corporations began restarting U.S. corporate subsidiaries in Germany, many of which had kept their operations going under the Nazis and produced weapons used not only against U.S. soldiers, but Soviet soldiers as well, Canadians, British, these companies began chafing at the commitments made at Yalta and Potsdam to allocate some 25% of their production to war reparation transfers to the USSR. Millions, if not billions of US dollars had been invested in shareholder equity in German companies before and after the First World War, especially so during the 1920s, immediately following the hyperinflation in Germany. And this is from the US Archives, a study of the investment of US companies in Germany in 1943 at the peak of the Second World War. The German subsidiary and its American parent company are printed out in the order of the greatest investment, with Standard Oil of New Jersey, Rockefeller's company, known in Germany as the Deutsche Amerikanische Petroleumgesellschaft, had a nearly $65 million investment in Germany. And down the list it went. Adam Opel, of course, was owned by the General Motors Corporation. Woolworths by Woolworths. Telephone Fabrik, the telephone factory in Berlin, was owned by IT&T, the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation. Singer by Singer, National Radiator in Germany was owned by American Radiator and Standard, International Harvester, Deutsche Vacuum, and Kodak, and so on. It goes for 2 pages, this list. Most of these companies, there you can see number 32 position, Coca-Cola. All of these companies, in fact, Kraft Cheese, number 44, all of these companies continued operations during the Second World War under Nazi Germany, even as Nazi Germany went to war with the United States in 1941. I think, just maybe a little bit off topic, the company that kind of surprises me most right here, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, Jehovah's Witnesses, who have over a $500,000 investment in Nazi Germany that remains intact even as Hitler is putting Jehovah's Witnesses into concentration camps, German Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll maybe enlarge this a little bit for you so you can get a better look at some of these names. Here's page 1. Let me move this a little bit so you see the number of investments as well. Ford is the 16th largest investor. There's Deutsche Hollerith in Germany, known as IBM in the United States. Roth Buchner is actually Gillette Safety Razor. Here's page 2. And there below, you can see the source, U.S. National Archives, Records Group 56, business holdings in Germany of the United States, firms circa 1943. These companies remained highly profitable during the Third Reich and during the war under Hitler. Some, like Coca-Cola, were innocuous and disguised themselves under non-American sounding brands. For example, for Coca-Cola, the Nazis came up with the name Fanta. This is the Nazi Coke, Fanta from Fantasia, from fantasy, and so forth. Other companies like General Motors and IBM became involved in both the war effort and the Holocaust, with IBM providing punch card system databases for the Nazis to track citizens classified as Jews under German laws, track their deportation, transport, and confinement and murder in the death camps. Ford Motor Company was perhaps one of the worst offenders, using slave labor, as did General Motors as well. Henry Ford himself personally was a supporter of the Nazis since the 1930s. In fact, Hitler will award Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest Nazi award available for a non-citizen. Ford, once, of course, Ford was a notorious anti-Semite, which is part of the reasons that he was given that award in the 1930s. He is the publisher of the Ford International Weekly, the Dearborn Independent, which was this anti-Semitic publication published in Michigan. Here are some of the covers. The Ku Klux Klan, an independent view. So certainly ideologically, Ford would have liked what the Nazis were doing. Ford built a huge manufacturing plant in Köln on the Rhine River. This is what the factory looked like. And of course, once Germany went to war, Ford built various platforms for all branches of the German army, including the SS, the Einsatzgruppen that were traveling throughout the East, killing Jewish men, women, and children, exterminating entire villages. They were doing this in Ford supplied trucks. In fact, the German Ford trucks had patented track systems that American trucks were not allowed to use. These gave the Germans the very high mobility for these vehicles, for these Ford trucks. And as well, of course, you had various weapon systems mounted on these Ford truck platforms. And armored versions as well. Interestingly enough, somehow the Ford works in Germany escaped any major bombing. The only bombing that occurred was just this little area right here at the bottom of the photograph. You can see where the cafeteria was located, and some basic administrative huts, but the factory itself, the assembly lines, were miraculously bypassed by the U.S. Air Force in the bombing of Germany. Ford just ticked on day by day in the war. And so this kind of interlocking business interests, for example, Sostenes Ben, who was the chairman of IT&T in partnership with the National City Bank, and AT&T had 28% in interest in the Fokker-Wulf aircraft company. So as these planes were shooting down American bombers over Germany, American shareholders were earning on their shares, although they would not be able to collect on those shares until after the war. And that is precisely the problem that is beginning to develop in Germany. Nazi German war industries built a huge debt to their American shareholders, which they would have been unable, a large part of it, to pay out to them, although some was paid out through neutral Swiss banks, while other payments were left in escrow under both Nazis and American law pertaining to, quote, trading with the enemy. American shareholders now wanted their interests in Germany unencumbered as soon as possible and not subject to collection for reparations to the Soviet Union. And so US business, Wall Street, essentially began to kick back on the issue of reparations coming from the western zones of Germany. And the first step towards this was going to be the economic unification of the American and British zones in January 1947, which would essentially lay the seed for the future Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, as it will be colloquially referred to. The US-British Unified Zone became known as the Bizone or Bizonia. France will join with its zone formally a year later in 1948. Together, Western economic interests began abrogating the terms of the German reparations being paid out of their zones to the Soviet Union. And so Russian post-war recovery, which depended on a resumption of trade relations, began to sputter and stall. Then, June 5th, 1947, George Marshall, Truman's U.S. Secretary of State, announced the U.S.-sponsored European Recovery Program, what would become known as the Marshall Plan, a large-scale American aid in the form of grants to war-torn Europe, with funds being allocated on a jointly coordinated basis by the Europeans themselves. There was nothing in the provisions of the Marshall Plan that theoretically excluded the Soviet Union from participating in the aid. However, looking at declassified documents from the U.S. archives some 50 years later, we know that at the time the Marshall Plan was devised, everybody was counting on the Russians would not sign up for the Marshall Plan, even if technically they were eligible. And everything was done to discourage them from signing up for the Marshall Plan. Its intention from the start was, of course, hostile to the interests of the USSR, in the sense that one of the Marshall Plan's objectives was explicitly to obstruct the rise of communism in Europe after the war. The catch was countries receiving Marshall Plan money, some 12 billion with a B dollars, needed to purchase American-made goods and were required to peg their national currency to the US dollar. European nations also had to coordinate their economic plan and the use of Marshall Plan funds with all the other European nations who subscribed to the Marshall Plan. 5%, $685 million of the Marshall Plan was for clandestine-run CIA operations to manipulate elections and fund anti-communist political parties and movements throughout Europe, in particularly France and Italy, Greece, and other countries. Something we've recently began to call election interference, but clandestine election interference in adversary countries is far from a Russian invention. There were a number of funding models, but primarily how the Marshall Plan worked was US dollars were paid to US suppliers for American goods or American goods produced abroad, as in the case of sugar, for example, from Cuba and Guatemala, which an American company essentially controlled and produced, the United Fruit Company. The goods were paid for in the United States with Marshall Plan dollars. They would be shipped to Europe at the Marshall Plan's expense. European distributors, wholesalers, would then pay for these goods in local currency, usually on credit, and then resell them into their local markets at a profit, thus building this local currency pegged to the US dollars, while at the same time keeping post-war American workers employed and American companies without the wartime orders for production now engaged in lucrative post-war contracts for the European market. It was basically communism. The Americans essentially funding US industry to distribute its products in Europe. The British and French jumped aboard immediately for Marshall Plan money. And on June 19th, the Allies invited the USSR to attend a tripartite conference. Britain, France, and the United States, Britain, France, and the USSR, hosted by the United States to discuss this US-backed aid program being offered to the Europeans. Inside the Soviet Politburo, there was a heated debate as to how to interpret the Marshall Plan. Some pessimistic Soviet advisors described the plan as amounting, quote, to the creation of a West European bloc as an instrument of US policy, instead of the previous uncoordinated actions directed toward the economic and political subjugation of European countries to American capital and the formation of anti-Soviet grouping. The Marshall Plan envisions a more extensive action aimed at resolving the problem in a more effective way. End of quote. That's the Soviet pessimistic view. Other Soviet advisors disagreed. They argued that the plan was not about Europe, but primarily a response to American post-war economic slumps, particularly a lack of demand for its exports in Europe. The purpose of the plan was to provide dollars to Europeans so that they could afford to buy American goods and services. The drawback to the Soviet Union not participating in this plan was it would facilitate US domination of Europe and strengthen the US hand in relations to the economic future of Germany, according to these advisors. Moscow itself had been hoping now for a large-scale loan from the U.S. to help in post-war Soviet reconstruction, and the Marshall Plan could provide such a framework for funding. Was this a threat or an opportunity? Stalin decided to keep an open mind, and he sent a Soviet delegation to the conference in Paris to assess the Marshall Plan in July 1947. But at the conference, the Soviets immediately were opposed to the idea of a central body coordinating the funding. Instead, they argued each country should draw up a list of its needs, which would be received by a series of committees and then transmitted to the Americans. The British and French, however, coached by the Americans, insisted on a highly coordinated pan-European program in which all the nations receiving Marshall aid money would integrate their economic goals and policies with an eye on the US dollar and the United States as an importer. And so that was not going to work. Molotov, who headed the delegation in Paris, rejected the notion, just as secretly the Americans hoped he would. Molotov would say, quote, "The question of American economic aid has served as a pretext for the British and French governments to insist on the creation of a new organization standing above the European countries and intervening in the internal affairs of the countries of Europe." End of quote. Worse was to come the same month. In July 1947, the Joint Chiefs of Staff Memorandum, JCS 1067, dated April 1945, which had directed the U.S. forces of occupation in Germany to, quote, "take no steps looking toward the economic rehabilitation of Germany or designed to maintain or strengthen the German economy," was now rescinded as the Marshall Plan was being introduced. It was now replaced by a new Joint Chiefs of Staff Memorandum, 1779, JCS 1779, stating among other things that, quote, "an orderly, prosperous Europe requires the economic contributions of a stable and productive Germany," end of quote. That, too, was a betrayal of the Yalta Protocols, calling for Germany to be deindustrialized and disarmed for at least 50 years. Soviet Union declined to participate in the Marshall Plan and then pressed their communist Eastern European client states not to participate further in the conference and refuse any consideration of accepting Marshall Plan aid. Almost all fell into line, including Finland, which was not exactly behind the Iron Curtain. Only one communist nation refused to take the cue from Moscow, Yugoslavia, under Tito. And Yugoslavia is the one country in the Eastern Bloc that's going to go at communism in its own way, and coincidentally will end up the most affluent and open of the Eastern Bloc communist nations. But it will make Stalin and Tito bitter enemies, and Yugoslavia will be expelled from the common form which had replace the Comintern. And so when the summer was over, in September 1947, the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky officially now denounced the Marshall Plan in a speech to the United Nations. He said, quote, "The Marshall Plan constitutes in essence merely a variant of the Truman Doctrine. The implementation of the Marshall Plan will mean placing European countries under the economic and political control of the United States and direct interference in the internal affairs of these countries. This plan is an attempt to split Europe into two camps, to complete the formation of a bloc of several European countries hostile to the interest of the democratic countries of Eastern Europe, and most particularly to the interests of the Soviet Union." End of quote. Of course, just how democratic Eastern European countries were by 1947, where Vyshinsky makes this speech, is laughable to describe them as democratic countries. But the speech becomes part of the two camps doctrine, a counter doctrine to the US doctrine of containment and the Truman Doctrine. Stalin rightly interpreted the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as an attempt to form an anti-Soviet Western bloc, one which Stalin now felt he needed to counter by consolidating the Soviet position in Eastern Europe, isolating the Soviet bloc from what he saw as outside subversive elements was now made a priority of Stalin's, rather than the maintenance of the Grand Alliance that he had dedicated himself to over the last 2 years. If anything, forced Stalin's hand to now put a totalitarian grip around the throats of the so-called progressive democracies, as he called them, then it was the introduction of the Marshall Plan, the objective of which was clearly threefold. One, to discourage the rise of communism in post-war Europe. Two, to keep American workers employed after the war was over. And three, isolate Marxist economies from the newly emerging post-war global economic structure. After 2 years of grudging cooperation with the West, in the hope that the United States will be true to the promises made to the Soviet Union at Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, and in between, Stalin now came to the conclusion that he had been betrayed by the United States. Stalin finally now understood Truman was not Roosevelt, and U.S. promises made to the Soviet Union had died with Roosevelt back in April of 1945. Stalin attempted to keep the alliance going from 1945 to 1947, but in September of 1947, he gave up. And now the Americans moved forward. There would be no reformation of a German government without settling the economic structure of Germany and the pre-war American corporate investments in it. That became the official line of the United States and as well its British and French allies. And that, of course, is going to impact the reparations flowing to the USSR. The US now began pouring millions of dollars into the Bizonia region of Germany, beginning this kind of reconstruction of Germany's infrastructure, at least West Germany's infrastructure. And now, in June of 1948, the French, British, and US announced their intentions to form a unified federal German government in their three zones in the West. And several days later, they introduced a new German currency. The old Reichsmarks that all four allies had been using would now be replaced by a US-backed Deutsche Mark. And of course, this immediately blew the old German currency, which the Soviets were using, down the toilet. The United States and Britain had proposed that a new German currency be created back in February of 1948, replacing the over-circulated and devalued Reichsmarks. The Soviets had refused to accept this proposal. And so now the three Western powers continued to work on their currency in secret and suddenly introduced the Deutsche Mark in their occupation zones on June 21st, 1948. The French, American, and British occupation zones now became known as Trizonia. The Soviets refused to honor the new currency, even in Berlin. But the Allies had already smuggled secretly some 250 million Deutschmarks into Berlin. And it quickly became the standard currency in not only the Western zones, but as well in the Soviet zone as Germans began refusing the worthless old Reichsmarks. This new currency, along with the Marshall Plan that backed it, appeared to be able to revitalize Germany against the wishes of the Soviets. Worse, by introducing the currency into West Berlin and its leakage into East Berlin, threatened to create this small island of economic resurgence deep within the Soviet zone, right under the noses of the communists in East Berlin and East Germany. Berlin had been divided administratively, but was not physically divided. Just a sign would delineate a British sector from the American sector, from the French sector, and the Russian sector. But as all this money poured into the French, British, and American sectors, in front of East German eyes, we began to see this kind of renaissance of building and reconstruction in West Berlin, but nothing in East Berlin. And at this point, East Berliners could circulate freely with West Berliners. You could almost see the ruins on the other side of this sign. You are leaving the American sector. And so this Stalin took as a provocation. Stalin accused the former allies of economic gangster speculation. And now he wanted the Western powers out of Berlin. On June 15th, 1948, the Soviet Union will cut off the three corridors from the Allied sectors of Germany to Berlin, declaring that the Autobahn leading into Berlin from West Germany was, quote, closed for repairs. 3 days later, all road traffic between the sectors was halted, And on June 21st, all barge traffic into Berlin was stopped. And finally, on June 24th, the Soviets announced that due to, quote, technical difficulties, there would be no more rail traffic to and from Berlin. The following day, the Soviets announced that the East Berlin sector and East Germany would not supply food to West Berlin unless paid for in old Reichsmarks. The Western powers had never negotiated a pact with the Soviets guaranteeing passage rights through those corridors. It was a courtesy decision on the part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviets immediately rejected arguments that occupation rights in Berlin and the use of these routes during the previous 3 years had given the West legal claim to unimpeded use of the highways, tunnels, and railroads connecting West Germany with West Berlin. And so began the 11-month-long Berlin blockade. At the moment it began, in June of 1948, Berlin had 36 days worth of food and 45 days worth of coal for heating and energy. Because both the US and Britain had demobilized their armies, militarily, the US and British were greatly outnumbered by the Soviet forces. And so, calling on Stalin's bluff, the US now proceeded to carry out the Berlin airlift, ferrying supplies to the city by air, considered still today a great logistical achievement of aerial supplying. CIA psychological warfare officers came up with the idea of throwing candy out of the landing planes at low altitude, ensuring that thousands of Berlin children would now gather beneath the flying planes for press photographers and newsreels. US media spun the story of how this was all about Berlin children being starved by the communists. Milk, the new weapon of democracy. The blockade backfired for Stalin, positioning him as an aggressor. German public opinion, which Stalin had hoped to coalesce into a united socialist Germany, had radically now turned against him. When the Allies agreed to reconvene the Council of Foreign Ministers, the CFM, that was administrating Germany, to reopen the discussion over the future of Germany, Stalin finally lifted the blockade on May 11th, 1949. But when the CFM reconvened in June of 49, as the Soviets attempted to return to the Yalta and Potsdam agreements with the restoration of a four-power control of Germany, they were rejected. It was now useless. Western powers were not interested. The other milestone in this early Cold War history is the founding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in April of 1949. The North Atlantic Treaty, which was signed in Washington, D.C., 4th of April 1949, it included Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and Britain, who had signed a treaty actually a month earlier. And then in April, the United States, Canada, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland joined this alliance. The treaty read in part, quote, "The parties of NATO agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each one of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties being attacked individually and in concert with other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area." And of course, this gave Stalin's fear of an anti-Soviet bloc a concrete form. The Soviet Union denounced NATO as incompatible with the Anglo-Soviet and Anglo-French wartime pacts and alliances, which forbade the signatories from entering into coalitions directed against each other. NATO is a violation of those treaties, wartime treaties. The Soviets were particularly upset with Italy joining NATO, as the Allied peace treaty with Italy precluded Italy joining any pact against any of the former Allied signatories. And yet, Italy was admitted into NATO. Stalin did not view NATO as an immediate military threat. In mid-1949, he told a Chinese communist delegate, quote, "A third world war is improbable, if only because no one has the strength to start it. If the imperialists wanted to start a world war, preparations for it would take at least 20 years. End of quote. And so as NATO came into formation, Stalin did not form an equivalent military alliance on his side. Not yet. 3 years later, 18th of February, 1952, Greece and Turkey would now also join NATO, again choking the Russians' access to the Turkish Straits. Suddenly, the Russians find themselves ringed from the Black Sea to the Arctic, to the Baltic, by NATO countries. But again, as late as 1952, Stalin still refrains from forming an equivalent alliance from the Soviet side with Soviet bloc nations. A third thing happens in 1949, aside the formation of NATO. August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb at a test site in Kazakhstan. Back in 1946, the United States had offered to put nuclear energy under the control of the United Nations General Assembly Atomic Development Authority. If all the nations of the world renounced nuclear weapons development and opened their facilities for inspection. This was known as the Baruch Plan, named for the lead U.S. negotiator at the United Nations, Bernard Baruch. The Soviets were opposed and called on the U.S. to first pledge to disarm their nuclear weapons and to place their nuclear energy program under the jurisdiction of the Security Council, where the Soviets had a veto. Stalin felt that in the General Assembly, where a majority vote prevailed, would be stacked against the Soviet Union, and correctly so in his understanding of the General Assembly in the United Nations at that time. And so Stalin wants nuclear energy to be put under the jurisdiction of the Security Council, where the five major powers have a veto, including the Soviet Union. Moreover, the Soviets were not at all comfortable with the inspection provision while they were attempting to develop their own nuclear bomb. And so the Baruch Plan will die, while the Soviets continued their crash program of nuclear development between 1945 and 1949. Although Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project that was developing the A-bomb, until 1945, Beria, the Soviet Minister of Interior, the head of the Secret Services, believed that the information being gleaned by Russian spies was disinformation. It was only after the successful Trinity test in the New Mexico desert and then the subsequent dropping of the two atom bombs on Japan that the USSR realized that the atomic bomb works and now kickstarted their crash development program. Beria was put in charge of the A-bomb project, codenamed Operation Enormous. Popular mythology holds that the Soviets had, quote, stolen the atomic bomb secrets. But in fact, the data that was being provided by Soviet atomic spies was being used by the paranoid Beria to check the work of the Soviet scientists rather than guiding them. The Soviets as well had their own robust scientific community, and just like the Americans, also used captured German scientists. Soviet test, codenamed First Lightning by the Soviets and Joe 1 by the US, yielded a 21 kiloton explosion. It was a duplicate of the US Fat Boy bomb dropped on Nagasaki. US, however, was shocked by this 1949 detonation. US intelligence had estimated that it would take the USSR another several years before they could successfully develop a nuclear weapon. The test was actually kept secret by the Soviets, but weather planes picked up trace radiation in the atmosphere, and in September, the US revealed that they had confirmed the Soviet Union had an atomic bomb. After a 6-month debate on how to respond to the successful A-bomb test, on January 31st, 1950, President Truman announced the decision to proceed with the construction of a more powerful H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb. And so now the nuclear arms race was on. April 1950, the U.S. National Security Council, an advisory council to the President of the United States on security and military issues, issued a classified document, National Security Council Memorandum 68, NSC 68, which would now shape U.S. government policy for at least the next 20 years. NSC 68 drew on George Kennan's long telegraph and his Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, essentially portraying the world divided into two poles between good and evil, between, quote, the idea of freedom under a government of laws and the idea of slavery under the grim oligarchy of the Kremlin, end of quote. It called on the United States as, quote, the center of power in the free world, end of quote, to confront and contain the USSR. And it emphasized military strategies now over the previous diplomatic ones. And certainly George Kennan would have allowed it. The Marshall Plan, it was exactly what George Kennan had suggested, that the Soviet Union be surrounded by democratic countries, European countries with, quote, robust economies, and that's exactly what the Marshall Plan intended to do. But George Kennan certainly did not advocate a military buildup to meet what he saw as the Soviet threat. That he felt would be dangerous. But NSC 68 now anticipated that the Soviet Union would attack the West the moment it gained nuclear superiority, and it called for massive funding of the U.S. military and nuclear weapons arsenals. In September 1949, at the same time, the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, or West Germany as we know it, formally came into existence. And a German parliament in Bonn was now reconvened for the first time since Hitler had neutered it in March 1933, some 16 years earlier. Stalin almost immediately responded with the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, or East Germany as we refer to it, or DDR in German, Deutsche Demokratische Republik. This was a great defeat for Stalin, considering that what Stalin had wanted was a united but friendly Germany. And this was not a very optimistic outcome for him. Now, Stalin had to deal with an entrenched East German communist regime, a technically sovereign East German communist regime, with the complications of negotiating for a future Germany with two hostile German governments, as well as the three hostile Western powers, France, Britain, and the United States, which continued to be nominally occupying Germany, even as the Federal Republic of Germany becomes a sovereign nation. It's still under military occupation and will be right into the 1990s. Stalin will be dead 2 years when the final blow will come. On May 9th, 1955, exactly 10 years to the day that a Germany that had killed some 29 million Russians had been defeated. Germany was now rearmed and admitted into NATO, into an alliance that was clearly an anti-Soviet alliance. The incorporation of West Germany into NATO in 1955 would horrify the Soviets and trigger now their response several days later, in fact, 5 days later, with the formation of the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance on May 14th, 1955. That's how long it took before the Russians responded to NATO, some 6 years. And so now we have two adversary nuclear superpowers and a bipolar matrix of NATO and Warsaw Pact countries, along with non-pact US or Russian aligned nations and semi-neutral non-aligned nations that the two superpowers would now pursue to bring into their respective camps. So, again, overall, Berlin blockade or not, Stalin behaved in Europe during the first 10 years with restraint and moderation when it came to the matter of confronting the West. He certainly rattled his sword, he made threats, but Stalin never had any realistic intention of going to war with the Western powers. The idea of that kind of war in Europe was inconceivable to Stalin, at least not in the next 20 years. But I jumped slightly ahead here to 1955 to post-Stalin era. Khrushchev, of course, will be the rising star. There is, in 1955, a kind of tripartite junta of Russians that have replaced Stalin. Khrushchev has not yet emerged out of this group of three as the leading figure to guide Soviet foreign policy. So it is at that moment an alliance of Molotov, Malenkov, and Khrushchev that will bring about the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. But returning back to the summer and autumn of 1949, just as the Russians were detonating their first nuclear bomb, another major development unfolded that would also very heavily impact Russian-American relations: the Chinese Revolution. China had been systematically conquered and looted since the 1840s, first by the British and then later by the Russians, Germans, Americans, French, Dutch, and other European nations, large and small. At one time, China was a major power in the region, dominating Asian territories like Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Indochina, the future Vietnam. Gradually, the European nations took control over these vassal states and colonized them, France in particular, in Cambodia and Indochina. China itself was too big to conquer entirely. Instead, China was forced into a series of treaties which gave European powers control over ports in China and allowed European nations to set up extraterritorial zones where Europeans lived and worked under their own laws and where Chinese could only enter by permission from Europeans. Hong Kong, seized by the British in 1842, was one of the last of these extraterritorial treaty system zones, transferred back to China only in 1997. Both Japan and Western powers were pursuing the mythical potential of markets in China, which in fact are only being materialized today at, of course, the expense of North American manufacturing power. Between 1920 and 1939, China's population would swell by 150 million, from 300 million to 450 million, compared to the US in the same period, which grew by only 20 million, from 105 to 125 million, again, between 1920 and 1939. By the 20th century, a growing Chinese nationalist movement begins to rise up among the Chinese. And in 1911, they overthrow the imperial rulers who had led China into this subservient state to Western powers and to Japan. The Republic of China, ROC, R-O-C, was established on October 10th, 1911, under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen of the Kuomintang, the KMT, or the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen, however, was unable to hang on to power, and China now succumbed to a series of civil wars as various regional warlords attempted to seize power. And this, of course, was of great advantage to all the different foreign powers inside of China who supported warlords of their choice, compliant with their own national interests inside of China. After the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1924, Chiang Kai-Shek, a Christian Chinese officer educated in Japanese military officers' school, took over the Kuomintang and began a military campaign to eliminate his warlord rivals in China. By 1928, Chiang Kai-shek managed to repress most of the warlords, establishing the Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek was favored by the European countries and by the United States, not so much by the Japanese. He had been baptized in 1927 in the Methodist faith, which made him very palatable to American interests in China. When the Japanese attacked China in 1937, the Republic of China was now put on the road to becoming one of the major allies, along with Britain, US, Russia, and eventually France, against the Axis, the alliance of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. That's how China will end up being given a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council at the San Francisco Conference in the spring of 1945. The primary opposition to Chiang Kai-shek came from the newly formed Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, under Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Chiang Kai-Shek and Mao Zedong fought a bitter civil war, and only the Japanese invasion of China probably prevented Chiang Kai-Shek from destroying the Chinese Communist movement, despite his attempts to do so, even as he fought the Japanese forces. During the later stage of the war with Japan, once the Americans got involved after Pearl Harbor, an uneasy peace would be maintained between the communists and the nationalists as they jointly fought the Japanese. But even then, occasionally Chiang Kai-shek would turn on his Mao Zedong communist allies and attack them. Because Russia was an adversary of Japan. In fact, the Soviets would enter into a short war with Japan in the spring and summer of 1939 in Manchuria. But because the Russians were focused on Japan as an enemy, Stalin supported Chiang Kai-shek, who was draining Japanese resources far more efficiently than Mao had been able to. Moreover, educated in the Japanese officers' school, Chiang Kai-shek was thought to be better qualified to fight the Japanese on a conventional battlefield than Mao Zedong, who was advocating this kind of newfangled guerrilla war. Of course, no sooner was Japan defeated in World War II when Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek now threw themselves at each other in a bloody civil war. Despite advice from American diplomatic and military officers in the field sent to Washington that Mao's communist forces were actually more popular in China, particularly among the peasants, which made up the majority of, in fact, almost all of the Chinese population, rather than the Christian and corrupt middle-class landlords and military officers of the Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek. They had very little sympathy, these middle-class officers, these landlords, for the fate of the peasants, which Mao Zedong claimed to represent. Nonetheless, Truman ignored the advice coming from the field and continued to back the Kuomintang in China. And of course, later there will be this big question, how did we lose China after the 1949 Mao Zedong revolution? Well, the answer obviously rests with the bureaucrats in Washington who did not pay attention to the people in the field in China. Stalin found Mao's revolutionary campaigns inconvenient, especially as he was attempting to implement his cooperative policies with the Grand Alliance in the immediate post-war period. You may remember at Yalta, Potsdam, even in Tehran, Stalin kept reaffirming to the Americans and the British his continued support of Chiang Kai-shek and rejection of Mao Zedong. Essentially, Stalin treated the Chinese communists in the same way he treated the Greek communists, with only one exception. While he continued to support the Kuomintang when the war ended. He did turn over captured Japanese arms to Mao Zedong. Otherwise, Stalin, up until 1949, was refusing to meet with Mao Zedong. But now, by January of 1949, as the Berlin blockade failed and relations with his former allies came apart, Stalin began to now search for new partners in this unfolding Cold War. Stalin, throughout early 1949, first attempted to persuade Mao Zedong to negotiate with the Kuomintang for a coalition government. Mao dismissed the idea. It was too late. The Chinese communists were pushing the Kuomintang toward defeat. In July and August of 1949, Stalin received a Chinese Communist Party delegation to Moscow after Mao Zedong announced his lean to one side policy. A partnership that Mao Zedong proposed between the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the USSR against global imperialist forces. Now, Stalin anointed the Chinese communists as the vanguard of the communist movement in Asia, quote, fulfilling a historic mission of unprecedented significance for the millions in India, Burma, Indonesia, and the Philippines. End of quote. If they choose, Stalin said he would support the Chinese formation of an Asian common form in which the USSR would participate as a half-Asian country. But it was not to be an equal partnership between Stalin and Mao Zedong. Stalin appreciated that the USSR was as badly in need, was still economically and militarily much advanced to China, and that Mao would be dependent on Soviet Union for aid. The Soviet Union would be the big brother in this relationship. Stalin would remain the pontiff of communism, with Mao Zedong as his Asian cardinal. Nor was Stalin particularly interested in giving up the concessions he got from the Allies for territory in China upon his entering the war with the Japanese back in 1945. These were not on the bargaining table. In October 1949, Mao Zedong won his war over the Nationalists, and the People's Republic of China was officially proclaimed, and the last Kuomintang troops withdrew from the Chinese mainland in December to the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. And there they established an exile Chinese Republican government, which still rules today under the name of Taiwan. Chiang Kai-Shek himself ruled there until his death in 1975. Taiwan would hang on to the Security Council seat, claiming to be the only legitimate representative of China. The United Nations General Assembly orchestrated by the United States, would reject the admission of the People's Republic of China into the United Nations 20 times before finally Richard Nixon began his negotiations with Mao Zedong, and China was then admitted to the United Nations in 1971, taking the Security Council seat, while Taiwan was completely kicked out of the United Nations and remains exiled from the UN to this day. And of course, as you look at this chart, China, UK, USA, USSR were the first four founding members of the United Nations, or the Allies as we refer to them. And of course, France, as you might remember from a few lectures back, is going to slip in onto the Security Council at the expense of Poland, making it 5 members of the Security Council, which is the situation as it remains to this day. November 1949, Mao Zedong now travels to Moscow to meet with Stalin. He would remain in Moscow for 3 months. There are contradictions between Mao's memoirs of the negotiations that took place in Moscow and the diplomatic notes that came out of the Russian archives in the 1990s. According to Mao Zedong, he told Stalin, quote, "I'm afraid it is necessary to undergo bilateral consultations to outline certain things, and these things must be both beautiful and tasty." End of quote. In Mao's language, beautiful meant world revolution, and tasty meant in Chinese interests. Mao claimed in his 1956 memoir, quote, "During my first meeting with Stalin, I submitted a proposal to conclude a new state treaty, but Stalin evaded a response. Subsequently, he avoided any further meetings with me. I tried to call him by telephone, but I was told that Stalin is not home." End of quote. Foreign Office notes from Russian archives report something else. Stalin, upon first meeting with Mao Zedong, told him immediately that the old Sino-Soviet treaty had been concluded, quote, "with the consent of America and England. With this in mind, in our inner circle, we decided not to change any articles of this treaty." In other words, Stalin would maintain the old Sino-Soviet treaty concluded with Chiang Kai-Shek's China, the Republic of China, with the consent of American and English allies. Stalin explained to Mao Zedong, again, according to the Soviet diplomatic notes released in the 1990s, Stalin explained that otherwise the former allies might attempt to change aspects of the Yalta Agreement regarding the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin and so forth. Stalin dismissed Mao's expressed concern over possible war, which were underlying Mao's demands for Soviet aid. Stalin told Mao Japan was not on its feet, while the US, despite its saber rattling, was really afraid of war as much as anybody else. Moreover, now the Soviet Union had an atomic bomb. just like the United States. It was no longer just one superpower on the block. There were now two superpowers. And so, according to the Soviet diplomatic notes, Mao apparently replied, quote, "We must act in a manner advantageous to the common cause. It is clear that we should not change the treaty now, and Soviet control over Chinese territory in Manchuria and Port Arthur corresponds to the interests of China." End of quote. But Mao did not leave the Soviet Union to go back to China. Now, Mao was sent to stew, almost as a prisoner, in a series of country houses in the outskirts of Moscow for nearly 2 months. In December of 1949, British newspapers reported that Mao Zedong was under house arrest. And indeed, Stalin was contemplating executing Mao in the way he had murdered dozens of senior foreign communist leaders and deputies who had displeased him while finding themselves inside the Soviet Union, either as delegates or Stalin's guests or as refugees from their own home country. Mao would be occasionally put in a limo and driven around on tours of Russian farms. And here is a picture of Mao Zedong looking at a bunch of cow rear ends, and we can just see how happy Mao Zedong is from his facial expression in this picture. And so Mao Zedong literally is on the brink of being exterminated by Stalin. But this delay, this 2-month delay, worked in the end in Mao's advantage. In January 1950, before Stalin could kill Mao, both India and Britain officially recognized Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China. And this now spurred Stalin to reconsider, because he now began to fear that China might slip over to the Western side. In the mid-1940s, Mao had been very accommodating and flirtatious with the US, hoping for some kind of recognition for his faction at the end of the Second World War. And Stalin also had intelligence reports from spies in China that reported Mao's deputy, Zhou Enlai, favored balancing the USSR's influence in China with an American presence there. And so Stalin decided it would be better to keep Mao Zedong alive and send him back to China rather than have his deputy, Zhou Enlai, come to power if Stalin killed Mao Zedong. And so January 22nd, Stalin will meet with Mao Zedong for a second time. Now he tells Mao that he had just, quote, discovered that the surrender of Japan made the old Sino-Soviet treaty obsolete. And now he is ready to negotiate a new treaty with China, even if it caused problems with his former allies, the British and Americans. The treaty imposed on China would be humiliating. Economic assistance from the Soviet Union would be minimal and would remain so until after Stalin's death in 1953. Mao Zedong had to make a personal allegiance to Stalin as the supreme communist leader. A Soviet ideologist was sent to edit all of Mao's writing to ensure that Mao maintained an orthodox communist line and that no so-called Tito syndrome was developing in China. As I said, Tito had taken Yugoslavia on a direction of its own path to communism, and Soviets were very unhappy with that, and they certainly didn't want to see China go on its own line. It was to stay keep the line of orthodox communism as defined by Stalin. The Chinese agreed to economic concessions in China for the Soviets, including free passage of Soviet troops through Manchuria to Port Arthur. Once again, that peninsula that the Russians had fought the Japanese over in 1905. There was a prohibition of foreign residence in Manchuria, which is going to become essential in the next year as this prohibition on foreign residence, particularly missionaries left over still from Chiang Kai-Shek's era, other foreign Western experts in Manchuria, once their presence there is now prohibited, U.S. intelligence will be blinded in that part of the world. As well, Stalin got a commitment from China for a joint global espionage network employing Chinese immigrants living abroad, of which there were many. In return, Stalin revealed several hundred names of his Chinese Comintern secret agents inside of China. Mao then murdered them all upon his return back home. What neither the Russians nor the Americans foresaw was that this development would suddenly make the Cold War hot, and in a place nobody had anticipated to be a problem or an issue, or even a place anybody had any interest in: Korea. What happens next, we'll look in our next lecture.